Today I'm going to show you how to put together your PDF sewing patterns in a really quick and easy way. So I've printed out my Phoebe Freebie pattern here. This is 38 pages, so that's quite a lot. But with this technique that Sue Stoney from That's Fashionista showed me, it takes hardly any time at all. So all you have to do is cut the corners off each page rather than actually cutting off all the borders, and there is a circle in each corner, and all you have to do is align those circles together with that cut out triangle and just tape it like that. It is so much quicker and easier. In addition, the Pattern Union sewing patterns come with these handy printouts for an envelope design. So you've got the front and the back, and all you have to do is stick them onto an A4 envelope, and then you've got a quick and easy storage reference for all your patterns. The envelope design is optional, and in your instructions it tells you which pages they are, so you don't have to print them out if you don't want to. So there we are, all done. So that took me 15 minutes just to tape that together, and in some ways that seems like a bit of time, but if I had sent the A0 pages off to be printed and driven there and picked them up, it would have taken me a lot longer than 15 minutes, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now, as you can see, this is a big pattern piece, but we do have the trousers and a top. So if you print pages 1 to 25, that's just the trousers, and if you just want the top, if you print pages 16 to 38, you'll get just the top. But we're going to make the top and the bottom, but this time as separates, and I'm going to show you how to hack it and make it into a knit version for lounging around in this time of Corona. The way we're going to hack our trousers today is to create a yoga style trouser, and that looks really nice with a deep waistband that isn't elasticated and is more fitted through the thighs. So as an example, I'll do a little illustration. We're going to have the deep waistband with the wide legs of the Phoebe Freebie. Now we're going to create a curved waistband, which means that it's going to have side seams as well. Here is my pattern all taped together. So this Phoebe Freebie is designed for woven fabrics, but I'm going to show you how to hack it for knit fabrics. The fabrics that are most suitable are things like cotton lycra, which have a lot of stretch. So to establish how much stretch your fabric has, take a piece of fabric which has the direction of greatest stretch going lengthwise. Put a pin at one point, and then using a ruler, put a pin that measures across 10 centimeters. Hold your thumb over the first pin and then stretch your material, and you can see this is really stretchy. I could actually take it up to 16 centimeters, but it comfortably goes to 15 with a good recovery. So that means that this fabric has at least 50% stretch, so that will be suitable for this design. As I'm hacking this trouser pattern into a knit garment rather than a woven garment, it actually needs to be smaller than my true size. And given that my fabric has 50% stretch, I'm actually going to go down 2 sizes for this design. So I've drawn around it in red so you can see it in relation to the other sizes. I'm going to take a different coloured pen, and I'm going to put in these measurements. So measuring from the high waist position, come down 12 centimeters and mark that with a dash. On the side seam, come down 12 centimeters and mark that with a dash as well. And then join those 2 dashes to create your new low waist seam. Now, this waist is going to be too big because it's designed for elastic, so we need to reduce the size of the waist so that it will sit snugly with a nice flat band. So I'm going to come in 3 centimeters from the side and mark that with a dash. I need to redraw the side seam on the trousers now, so I'm going to measure down 45 centimeters and mark that with a dash. I don't want my side seam to be straight anymore because it needs to contour to the body, so I'm going to use a French curve to redraw that side seam. So I'm going to place the French curve and I'm going to line the top of it with the notch at the waist and the notch on the side and redraw that line. So all of this is being removed. In preparation for the waistband, I also need to know what this new waist measures. So on your diagram, we're calling that measurement A. So measuring across, that is 23 centimeters on this pattern. Now we're going to do the back. I've turned the pattern around so that it's easy for me to access the back pattern piece. So the back needs to match the front. So we came down on the side seam, 12 centimeters on the front side seam. So we need to do the same on the back and mark that with a dash. For the centre back though, I'm only going to come down 9 centimeters because we're making this a more fitted garment and I just need a bit more extra room in the back rise in order to fit well. So I've marked those two lines and I'm going to join them together. Again, we need to reduce this waist measurement for the waistband. So I'm going to measure in 3 centimeters and mark that with a dash like I did on the front and come down 45 centimeters from that high waist position and mark that with a dash. Then I'm going to take my French curve and redraw that side seam. And all of that will be removed. Next, I need to also reduce the inseam of the back leg. If it's too deep through here, I'm going to end up with bunching and gathering at the crotch and that won't look nice on a fitted garment. So I'm going to measure in 3 centimeters on the crotch and mark that with a dash. Now, I have a full bottom, so that's going to suit me, but if you have thin thighs, you might actually want to measure in 5 centimeters to really reduce that seam, which also will reduce the amount of fabric you've got through that back leg. Next, I'm going to measure down 27 centimeters and mark that with a dash on my inseam on the back leg, and I need to redraw that seam as well. And again, I'm going to use my French curve because we want to have a slight curve in that shaping. And all of that will be removed. So obviously you can tailor this to yourself. You might like to have less of a rise in that centre back and you can take out more from that inseam. You also might find that you want to reduce the width of the leg at the hip level as well. But all of this will come from trying on your garment and seeing how your fabric behaves. Now we are ready to trace off our front and back leg pattern pieces. Before you trace it off, just check that the inseam measurement plus 4 centimeters is the right length for your legs. I have short legs, so either I make a deeper hem, which I quite like, or I could also shorten the pattern. I like to trace off my patterns rather than cut out the paper version because, as in this case, I can have a knit version and a woven version that both are going to fit me without having to print and tape off that pattern multiple times. I like to use Vilene, which is a mid-weight, non-woven interfacing. It's transparent, which makes it very easy to trace off the patterns. It doesn't particularly crease, which means that when I store it in my envelope, I can get it out multiple times and it's still going to sit nicely on the paper, on the fabric, and it doesn't tear like tissue paper does. So again, it's just a really great fabric to use for tracing off your pattern. In addition, if you have a fabric that's got a directional print on it, you can actually see through the Vilene to place your pattern pieces so that you get really nice pattern matching. So I'm going to trace that off now. Now I'm going to construct my waistband pattern. To start with, I need to draw a vertical line, which is going to be my centre front or my centre back centre line. Next, I need to square off from this line and this becomes my low waist line. To establish where my high waistline is, I'm going to measure up 14 centimetres and I'm going to mark that with a dash. And I need to square off from here as well. Now if you don't have a set square, all you have to do is come up to another place, mark that 14 centimetres and draw another line. And this is going to be my high waist line. Next, I need to calculate what the measurements are for each of these. So on the instructions you can see that the measurement for here is A minus 1, and for the high waist measurement it is my waist minus 8 centimetres divided by 4 and plus 1 equals. So for the low waist we measured the pattern and that was 23 centimetres and we're taking away 1 centimetre, so my final measurement for there is 22. So I'm going to measure along this low waist position and mark 22. For the high waist you can use your waist measurement. My waist is proportionally smaller to my hips, so it's important for me to do this and not just go off the size chart. So for me that's going to be 64 minus 8 centimetres divided by 4 and plus 1. So 64 minus 8 is 56 divided by 4 plus 1, which is 14 plus 1, which equals 15. So that is my final high waist measurement. I then measure across 15 centimetres and mark that with a dash. Now rather than joining that as a straight line, I need to curve this waistband. So we're going to measure up 3 centimetres, which I'll use the other colour pen for that, from the low waist, mark that with a dash, and on the high waist we're going to measure up 3 centimetres and mark that with a dash. Now we're ready to draw in the curved lines of our new waists. So I'm going to take my French curve again and line that up with that low waist raised measurement of 3 centimetres and draw that new low waist line. And then I'm going to do the same with the high waist using my French curve and redrawing that line. Next I can draw my side seam, which is a straight line, and there is my side seam. So this is a quarter of the front or back, so to trace off the pattern I need to open that out. So I'm going to do that straight onto my violin. So here I have a piece of violin to trace off my waistband pattern. I'm going to start off by marking that centre front or back and then drawing in the side seam. And because this is violin, it's really easy to see through and trace this off easily. Next I'm going to take my French curve again to draw the curves of the high waist and the curve of the low waist. Now I need to reflect that so I've got a whole half piece. So the easy way to do that is to fold it in half along that centre line, and I could flip that over and trace it again, but since we're hacking the pattern, I'm going to show you how I do it. I literally just cut through both layers so that I end up with the whole pattern piece like so. So you can see I didn't actually need to draw around it at all, and I have my centre marked, so I can mark that with a notch indicator top and bottom for the centres. So I need to have 2 of these. I need one for the front and one for the back, so I'm going to trace off another. and it's a good idea to write the pattern information on there as well. So I'm going to call this one my front, and I need to cut ×1 of the outer fabric and ×1 of the lining. And that will be the same for the back, because this waistband is going to be self-lined so that it's nice and supportive and stays up. Next, I'm going to hack the top. So the top is essentially the same as the original. It's got that centre front seam with the opening, the knotted front that goes over as a sort of over the shoulders and ties at the back. But this time I'm actually going to elasticate the waist, and I think this time I'm actually going to use a thick elastic, although I could use a thin elastic as well. Because we're making this as a two-piece, we want to actually trace it off with the low waist position, not the high waist position. But if you're quite short in the body, you might want to go somewhere in between, or you might even use that position as well. But I suggest you start longer because you can always cut it off. And also, we're not adding a waistband, we're going to be turning this up to make the elasticated waistband. So the only actual hack that we have on this pattern is the tie. So because we're making it in knit, we're going to overlock around the edges rather than finishing it off with a sewing machine. So really with a knit, you do have options. Knits don't fray, so if you wanted to, you could actually leave this as a raw edge. And with some knits, they're quite, they roll a bit. So when you give them a good stretch, they just roll back on themselves, and that's a really nice finish too. So again, experiment with some offcuts, see what finish you like. But in this example, I'm going to overlock it. So what I need to do is just use my French curve to draw on some curved edges for that top, like so, and then I'm just going to trace off the front and back top. Storing your patterns is quite easy. You could either fold that up and put it into your envelope, but what I like to do is actually just roll up the paper version like this and just store it in a large box where I have all my paper patterns, and that makes it nice and accessible, because the main one that I use is the Violin version in the envelope, unless I particularly change size or I'm making it for someone else and I need another size. So just roll it up and pop a rubber band around it. You might want one at both ends, and there you have it. So here are my pattern pieces laid out, all traced onto the Violin. Now you can see if I just sort of flap my hands around, the Violin really isn't moving, which means that I almost don't need to use pins, and sometimes I don't. All I use are some paper weights to hold everything in place. So because I'm doing the top and the bottom, I am using quite a bit of fabric, and your layouts may change a bit depending on the size that you are doing. But what you need to look out for is that the direction of greatest stretch goes from selvage to selvage. So I've got this folded in half, it's quite nice and wide, so it's a fairly economical layout. So I'm going to cut this out. So I've cut the trouser legs out, pulled the fabric down, and here is my front and back top with the front and back waistband for the trousers. And so that's a bit of wastage, but not too much. I'm sure I could get some nice pairs of knickers out of that. As you're cutting out, don't forget to mark the notches on your waistband pieces, so the centre front and centre back of the high and low waist, the notch point on your back top, and the notch point on your front top. So let's get those cut out. Okay, so here I have my front trouser and my back trouser. I've put the fabric together, right sides together, and pinned along the crotch curve on the front and the back. The waistband pieces I have just put to one side. Now I'm going to overlock these seams. So you could use your overlocker set to a 4 thread, or you could use a narrow zigzag on your sewing machine. The choice is up to you. So I'm going to start off by just sewing down the centre front. have a 1 centimetre seam allowance on this, so I can afford to trim off a little bit, which also helps make that a nice neat seam. When I come to the end, a little trick that I like to do is called chaining on. So I just line up the next portion that I'm sewing without taking that one out and carry on sewing. This is really good for if you're wanting to conserve thread, especially if you're using something like Gutermann, which is a bit more expensive. You don't want to run out, so chaining on is really an efficient way of working. When you've finished that seam, snip the threads, snip where you've joined, and snip the other thread. Now I'm ready to sew my side seams. So this is the back piece, opened so it's the right side up, and I'm going to open out the front and place that on top, right sides together. Now the way that I like to work is to pin the top and then the bottom and work my way in towards the middle. So I'm going to put a pin in at the top, come down to the hem, put a pin in, and then you can just sort of pat the edges of the seam together. And so if you have a particularly stretchy fabric and the pieces have don't seem to match, but you know that they should match because you've cut them out, then this is a great way of making sure that your seam comes together without any stretching or pulling at either end. And you can use this on all kinds of fabrics. I've turned the pants around so that I now have the other side seam closest to me. Put a pin at the bottom, pin at the top, and do the same technique of just patting that seam together, and a few more pins, and then I'm going to overlock the two side seams. Now I'm going to overlock those two side seams, so I'm going to sew down one side and then back up the other, chaining on as I go. Snip the threads, and we're ready to sew the inseam. I've sewn the side seams and now I'm going to do the inseam. So like with the side seams, I take the hem and put a pin in there. Then I come up to the crotch point, pop a pin in there, and then over to the other hem and put another pin in. Then I can open out that leg and just tap it into place so that the seams are matching, like so, and then just use a few pins. I don't like to use too many pins. I find that it slows me down. So one leg, bring the other leg over, tapping it into position so it's nice and even. And there I have my inseam pinned, and I am ready to overlock. Overlocking the inseam is very quick and easy. It's just one long continuous seam. And there we have it, inseam sewn, and just trimming those threads. Now we're ready to do the waistband. Having sewn the side seams and the inseam on the trousers, we're now going to turn it through to the right side and then pop it to one side whilst we do the waistband. So we're going to take the waistband pieces, and we have two pairs. So we've got the front and the front lining, and the back and the back lining, like so. So I'm going to take those two pattern pieces and put them to one side. and I can just actually pop them in with the trouser leg pieces, fold them up and just stick them into my handy storage envelope. Once again, we want to make sure that we have our pattern pieces right sides together. So that's the outer pair and the lining pair, right sides together. So we are going to put pins just on those side seams. And I find that if you pin perpendicular with the head of the pin away from the seam, it is much easier in your sewing process because you can just easily pull them out, and hopefully there is less chance that you will sew through them, particularly on the overlocker. Okay, so there we have the outer and lining, and we're going to overlock those 4 side seams. As before, when I sew the side seams, I'm going to be chaining on because it's quicker, more efficient and saves thread. Side seams are sewn. Now I need to join the 2 waistbands together so that I have my lining and outer as one. So I'm going to turn one the right way out and tuck that inside the other one so that I have right sides together. I'm going to start by pinning the side seams at the top. There's one. Bring this one over and pin those side seams. Then I'm going to work my way around to where I have my little snips for my centres, so the centre front and centre back, and pop a pin in there, and round to the other centre and pop a pin in there. So there we have the 2 waistbands pinned together at the top. Having pinned my waistband lining and my waistband outer together, I am going to overlock around that top seam, starting at a side seam. So here I have overlocked around the top. Now I'm going to turn this through to the right side, and I could either have that as my final finish, or I can edge stitch the seam allowance to the lining. So I can either use a zigzag stitch along there or a cover stitch, and in this example I'm going to use my cover stitch machine. I'm going to use my cover stitch machine to edge stitch that seam. So I'm going to start from a side seam. See which way you find that the overlocking sort of has a natural way that it wants to turn, so for me it's going that way. So I'm going to start my cover stitch and making sure that my seam allowance is facing the way that my stitching is going so that it catches it. And then a friend gave me this tidy little tool, which is a rounded point awl. Lift up the foot and you can just grab the threads easily like that, and it stores very tidily in that screw hole. Snip the threads and just pull it out sharply, and there we have our lovely cover stitch. And so what I'm going to do now is turn that through so that the cover stitch is on the inside, which is the lining, and I'm going to take my pins and now I'm going to pin the bottom edge together, so starting with my side seams and then moving my way around to my notch points, back to the side seam, and and the other center notch point. And what you'll see is because I've edge stitched, now that waistband is rolling, the lining is rolling in nicely to the inside, whereas when I had, if I was just going to leave it, it wouldn't sit quite so flat. To join my waistband to my trousers. So my trousers I've already turned the right way out, and then I'm going to put the waistband on. So I'm going to slide the trousers into the waistband so that I have right sides together. And I'm going to start off by pinning the center front with the center front notch of my waistband. Around to the side seam, so my side seams all match. To the center back, matching the center back notches with the center back side seam. And finally, my last side seam, pinning them together. You could use more pins if you wanted, but I find that actually it makes it a bit more difficult to sew on the overlocker, because I like to have a bit of room to actually sort of hold the material and manipulate it through the machine. So now we're going to overlock the waistband to the trousers. When I'm overlocking the waistband to the trousers, I like to start at the center back. So I just lift the foot on the overlocker so I can tuck the material underneath, and then I just sew a few stitches to get going. And that's just holding everything in place. Then I'm coming up to the side seam and I give that a little pull and just align all those edges of my seam allowance like so. And because the waistband is slightly curved, I give it just a little pull so that the trouser sits into it, and then I sew. Before I get to the side seam, I pause because I kind of want to blend around that, because that's a sharper curve, and I want to make sure that all my seam allowances are matching and lined up. Pause. And just sort of blending in a way those seams together and just checking that everything is still lined up, because when you edge stitch it causes the lining piece to become slightly longer than the front because it's causing a roll over at that seam. So you just want to make sure that you are in fact catching everything, which is another reason why just trimming off 1/2 centimetre as you go just is like a little fail safe to make sure that you are in fact catching all the layers. And notice how I just sew in short spurts so that I can keep re-checking all my seam allowances. Blending over the side seam and coming up to finish on that centre back. And because I cut in using the knife on the overlocker to cut the material, I'm just going to over sew, sewing a few stitches, not cutting anything. Then I have the needles up, lift the foot, just slide the material out from the foot without actually pulling it, and then carry on sewing and then cutting the threads. And you can see I have a perfectly neat finish now. But again, I think it gives a nice finish. So I'm opening out my waistband and I'm going to do a line of cover stitching so that the seam allowance of the waistband folds down into the body of the trousers. So I'm going to start from the side, and I like to start from the left hand side of the side seam, and I'm just going to slide that under the foot. It's a little bit lumpy because of that intersection of those seams meeting. And then for me, some of these things are a bit like braille. You need to use your fingers to tell you where things are. So I'm just feeling to make sure the seam allowance is facing to the left, and I'm going to start sewing. So on my machine, I could have the option of 3 needles. So I've got the left hand needle and the middle needle. nothing in the right hand needle, and I use that little guide there where the right needle would be to run along my seam to get a perfectly even distance on my seam. So notice how when I'm sewing I've got my hand kind of open into an L, so I'm using my fingers to hold the material securely behind and my thumb just to sort of feel the seam allowance underneath, and then my right hand is also feeling to make sure the seam allowance is tucked under. So rather than stretching it from the back and front, I'm actually more stretching it sideways, although not really, but it's just enough to keep it flat. Needles up, lift the foot, bring the threads forward, snip that loop and pull it out sharply to the back and trim those threads. And there we have the waistband cover stitched with the seam allowance going down, and I think that's a really nice finish. And I didn't have the correct matching colour, but actually I really like that contrast thread. Now to finish off the trouser hem. So what I like to do is also cover stitch that hem, but if you wanted to you could turn it up and sew it with a zigzag, or even you could actually put twin needles onto your regular sewing machine and use a twin needle stitch. So to make doing the hem easy, I like to draw on the fold line. So I'm using a friction marker pen, which I have tested on this fabric, and I know that the lines will come off when I use an iron. But just always check on a scrap piece before you actually do this. So I'm going to give myself an 8 centimeter hem because I have quite short legs and I like a deep hem as well. So I mark it in 2 places and rule across, flip it over to the other side and do the same thing, measuring up 8 centimeters and ruling a line. And then I can turn up following that line that I have just drawn. So I'm tucking the material in and just giving it a little pull to snap it into position. And what I like to do is actually just put some pins around that folded edge of the hem to stop it from moving. So just at the quarter points really. Then when I cover stitch, which has to be on the right side of the fabric, I'll be able to feel where that cut edge is. But if you feel like that's a bit risky for you, you can also just use your finger and actually just sort of mark on the material where your stitching line will be, and actually just draw that with the pen as well, because if you know that it's going to disappear, it's fine to do that. And so you would be coming down slightly, so this wouldn't be exactly 8 centimeters out because your stitching line doesn't want to be exactly on the line of the cut edge. So now I'm going to do the other side. Now I'm going to sew the hem. I always like to start from the inseam when sewing the hem so that my overstitching is a bit more discreet than if I was to start on the outside leg seam. So, there we go. One leg. Now to remove those pins, and I will do the other leg again, starting from the inseam. Trim those threads, remove the pins, and then I'm just going to give this a press, because while you wouldn't normally press a knit garment, it's just going to help it make sit nice and flat and just that make the fold of the hem nice and crisp and get rid of my drawn line, but because I used a purple pen it hardly shows in anyway. So there it is. Let's try them on. So here they are, my finished Phoebe Freebie, hacked from a woven into a knit to make my Corona lounging pants. I'm loving these. They're super comfy, and this wide waistband I think is really flattering. In addition, because I use my own measurements, for the back there's no gaping, which is what I would normally get, because they're personalised, and that's what's great about making your own clothes. I'm wearing it with an Eva tee, which has also been slightly hacked to have shorter sleeves, and these are fantastic. I can see my whole isolation living in these. I'm going to have to make them in other colours as well. I can't wait to see what you do too and how you're spending your quarantine. So don't forget, tag me at Pattern Union, hashtag Phoebe Freebie hack. Now we're going to make the top for our Corona lounge suit. So here I have my two pattern pieces. So I've got the back and the front. So what we want to do is open out the back first so that the centre back is facing each other and it's the right way up, and then we're going to take the front piece and lay that on top of the back, right sides together. So right side and right side, and then we're just going to pin the side seam on both halves, and we're going to overlock that side seam. So I'll just swing that around to do the other side. So this might feel like a sort of slightly unusual method, but the way we're going to finish off the neckline is that we're going to do that before we sew the centre front and centre back seam. So last pin, don't need too many, and there we have it. Going to go and overlock those side seams. So the first thing I'm doing is overlocking the side seams. So I'm going to do a technique called chaining on, where I go down one side and then don't cut the threads, but actually keep sewing and carrying on up the other side. And cutting those threads. Next, I'm going to do the neckline. So because this is going to be my finish around the ties, I want to set my overlocker to being a narrow stitch. So I'm just going to flick my little lever forward, and I'm going to change my stitch length as well to about 2.5, so it's a bit closer together. But if I wanted to, I could actually just leave the edges raw on this, because knit fabrics don't fray. So that's another nice finish too. So I'm going to start off by sewing up the centre back. So I've got my notch mark there. So I'm just going to have my needles up and lift my machine so it sits over that notch. And I'm just going to sew up to the top. Whatever you do on one side, you want to do on the other. And that's another reason why topping and tailing is a really good idea. So I've sewn up the back on one, so I'm going to sew down the back on the other half, coming off at my notch, cutting those threads, and you can see that's quite neat, that narrower overlocking. Next, I'm going to sew the armhole and tie portion, so not the top of the back. So going around, and I'm going to again top and tail this one. I'm getting to the top of the tie where this curve is, so just watch my hands as I handle this. I don't want to overstretch it, but I do want a smooth edge, so I'm just going to use my fingers kind of as weights and twist them slightly as I sew. And there you can see That's a really nice rounded edge on the top of my tie. Now I'm coming down the centre front. So I'm up to my notch and I'm just going to sew off where the notch is. And then for the other half, I've got my centre front notch and I'm going to sew on at the notch. So I'm topping and tailing and also chaining on. And finishing off. Now I'm going to reset my machine back to being the wider stitch and the normal stitch length. So my camera had a bit of an issue then and missed a whole section, so I'm just going to tell you what I did. And then I sewed across the two top halves. So here I have the two halves and I've lined them up on the centre back right way up. I'm going to fold them over so the two halves are matched, right sides together. Now what I'm going to do is pin the centre back, so from the notch and the hem and a pin in between. Then I'm going to do the front, so pinning the hem, just turn it sideways a bit so it's easier, making sure my pins are perpendicular to the seam and the purl head is outwards, matching my notches and just putting a pin in the middle. Now I'm going to overlock the centre back seam and the centre front seam, but when you're doing it, make sure that you leave a tail at the top, and I'm going to show you a little trick. Now I'm going to sew that centre back and centre front seam, and I'm going to start from the bottom and sew up towards the top. When I get to the top, I make sure that my overlocking edge that I finished off for the ties is nice and neat, and then I'm just going to sew straight off the edge. This time I have left a long tail of thread, and I'm going to take a darning needle which has a blunt end and a large eye, and I'm just going to thread my overlocking threads through the needle, and then I'm going to feed the needle back through onto itself with that overlocking, like so, and then just pull that through. And what that does, it means that when I trim those overlocking threads, I've got a really neat edge. There's no fraying threads, and when I open it out, it looks really good. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. So starting from the bottom, leaving myself a nice long tail of thread, threading that back through onto itself to finish it off nice and neatly so there's no fraying threads around, and trim that off. Now we're ready to finish off the centre back so that it has a fold over channel for us to thread the ties through. Now you can either use a zigzag on your straight stitch machine, or you could use twin needles and give the effect of a cover stitch, or you can use a cover stitch machine like I'm going to do. To finish off the back neck, we're going to fold over the back neck portions 4 centimeters. So because I'm going to cover stitch mine, I'm just going to put pins along the fold because I need to sew on the right side along the seam allowance. If you were using a zigzag, you could pin along here and sew on the wrong side. Alternatively, if you were unsure about your measurements, you could certainly use an erasable pen and draw a 4 centimeter line over to gauge how far over to fold your lines. Now I'm going to cover stitch the back channel that I'm going to thread my front ties through. When I get to the end, needles up, lift the foot, bring the threads forward using this tidy little awl that I keep stored in a screw hole, and sharply pull it out and snip your threads. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Needles up, foot up, threads forward, snip them in the loop and sharply pull to behind. And just trim those threads. Remove the pins, and I think that looks really neat, and because I use the cover stitch on the pants, this is going to make it tie in nicely. So we're nearly done. You could at this point just hem the top, but I'm going to put some elastic in there, so I'll show you how I do that. So I have my elastic, so you can use any elastic that you would wish to use. This elastic measures 4 centimeters, but what I find is that when you sew a hem or a channel that you're going to put elastic through, you don't want it to be the exact measurement of the elastic, because there actually is a little edge here, and so you need slightly more than the actual measurement, so I always add on 1/2 centimeter. So what I'm going to do is draw a line using my friction pen, which I know is going to come off when I iron it, and I'm going to mark 4.5 centimeters along the hem so that I can draw in my fold line to make sewing this hem easier, like so. Flip it over to the other side, and I'm doing this on the right side of the fabric. Drawing it in. Like that. Next, I'm going to measure my elastic. So I'll turn the camera so you can see. I'm going to take the elastic and just wrap it around my low waist. Now, I don't want to pull it tight because I actually want this to be quite a relaxed, soft fit. So I've got like a little bit of overlap, plenty of room, and I'm just going to grab my scissors and cut that off, and I've got about 2.5 centimeter overlap, so you can see that's sitting quite low and comfortable. I could always tighten this, and so it's much better to have it a bit looser than tight. Now I'm ready to do the hem. I could just fold the hem over and use a cover stitch to finish it off, but I think because I'm going to thread the elastic through, it's probably easier just to overlock this edge and sew a straight stitch, so that I can leave a little channel to thread the elastic through and then just close it off. On the cover stitch machine, it'll be a little trickier and perhaps not look as neat in the end. I don't necessarily need to overlock this edge because it won't fray, but I like how it looks, so I'm going to. Now I'm ready to do some straight stitching and thread the elastic through. Now I'm going to use a straight stitch to sew this hem. So even though this is stretch and it would be perhaps better to use a zigzag stitch, I prefer how a straight stitch is going to look. But because this is quite wide and I know that it's not going to get a lot of stress on it and the threads won't crack, I feel comfortable doing that. So I'm going to sew it from a side to leave an opening at the side so that I don't have to have any sort of overstitching at the centre back or the centre front. I've got my drawn on fold line, so it's very easy for me to see where I need to sew, and I'm just going to sew in the middle of the overlocking. So I'm going to have it on a sort of slightly longer stitch to allow it to have some stretch. So a little back tack, pause, turn it up on that drawn line and sew. Okay, now I'm coming up to the end, and because my elastic is 4 centimeters wide, I'm going to leave a 4 centimeter opening so I can easily get it in. Little back tack to make sure it's secure, and take the fabric out and snip those threads. And that's how it looks from the right side. Now I'm ready to thread the elastic through. I'm going to use this little tool which is used for threading elastic or rouleaus through tubes, and you just clamp it over the edge and then bring this ring down to make sure it's nice and secure, and then that's not going to come off. But you could use a safety pin as well. So I'm going to thread that into the opening of my channel. Just slide it over a bit to get it started, and there you can see, even though I made that channel 1/2 centimeter wider than the 4 centimeters, that is actually sitting very securely and nicely. So I'm just going to thread that all the way through. And back out the other side, taking care not to twist the elastic. Take your threading tool off, and now we're going to join the elastic. So I'm going to overlap the elastic, and I'm going to sew down one side, a diagonal up and down the other, again using a straight stitch. Make sure you back tack at each end. Like so. Now we're just going to gently pull the elastic so that gets absorbed into the channel. And a little pull like so, and you can see it disappearing. But before I rearrange all the gathers so that they're nice and evenly dispersed, I actually want to just close that little hole. So keeping my machine on the straight stitch, I'm just going to over sew by about 1/2 centimeter, making sure I don't catch the elastic as I close that seam, and trim those threads. So now I'm going to pull that elastic so that the gathers evenly disperse around the top. The way this top is designed is to have a knot at the centre front that threads through the back. So before we put it on, let's just do that. So I'm just going to tie a double knot that can be adjusted once it is on. And if you tie a reef knot, you get a nice flat front. Then we're going to thread the tails of the tie through those centre back channels, and because it's a knit, you can actually just push it through without using a tool, but you know, maybe it would be easier with a tool like that. So that's around, and then this one, threading that through like so. So there's my ties and the centre back, and then that will tie in a knot as well, but I'm not going to tie that until I try it on. So how cute is that little top? Looks great with jeans. So when you're tying this knot, what you want to do is make sure you don't tie it too short at the back, because the tighter you tie that, the higher it's going to rise. So this is the long-waisted version with it turned up to make a channel for the elastic, but if you wanted, you could actually make it slightly longer as well. So there we have it, worn with jeans. Let's see how it looks worn with our yoga pants. Here it is, ta-da! My Phoebe Freebie, hacked to be made into the Corona Lounge suit in a knit rather than a woven. I'm loving this. All the versatility of separates, worn together, it's like a jumpsuit, super comfy, great for lounging around in isolation, but if you wanted to, these pants would be perfect for doing yoga in as well. I can't wait to see what you do, so don't forget, tag me at Pattern Union and hashtag Phoebe Freebie Hack.